The salt water burned in Karga's lungs as she sank beneath the waves for what felt like the 100th time, her arms too weak to fight the current anymore, her mind barely registering the laughter of her former clan mates fading into the distance above the surface. She had trusted them, believed that bringing back information about the human settlement's defenses would prove her worth to the war chief. But instead, they had called her a traitor for speaking against attacking a village full of farmers and children. And now the ocean was swallowing her whole. The last thing she remembered before darkness took her was the strange peace that came with giving up, letting the water fill her mouth and nose as she tumbled deeper into the blue-green abyss. 3 days later, Henrik Lawson was walking the rocky beach near his small farm as he did every morning, checking the tide pools for crabs and watching for driftwood he could use for repairs, when he spotted something large and pale green wedged between two barnacle-covered boulders. At first he thought it might be a seal or dolphin that had washed ashore, but as he got closer his heart nearly stopped because he realized it was a person, an orc woman, her muscular frame twisted at an uncomfortable angle, seaweed tangled in her black hair, wearing what looked like leather armor that had been shredded by rocks and waves. He should have walked away, should have pretended he never saw her, because everyone in the nearest village 3 miles inland would call him a fool or worse for helping one of the green-skinned raiders. But Henrik had been a medic in the border wars before he retired to this isolated stretch of coast, and his hands were already moving to check for a pulse before his mind caught up with the decision. She was alive, barely, her skin cold as ice and her breathing so shallow he had to put his ear right against her mouth to confirm it. Henrik knew he had maybe an hour to get her warm and breathing properly, or she would die right there on his beach. So he hooked his arms under her shoulders and started dragging her across the sand toward his cottage, grunting with effort because even half drowned and emaciated, she probably weighed as much as he did. His dog, a gray wolfhound named Timber, came bounding down from the house and started barking at the strange visitor, but Henrik shouted at him to hush and help, and the well-trained animal fell silent and trotted alongside them as if escorting a funeral procession. Getting her up the rocky path to his cottage took another 20 minutes and left Henrik's back screaming in protest, but he finally managed to wrestle her through the door and onto the thick fur rug in front of his stone fireplace. He built up the fire until it was roaring, then carefully removed her ruined armor and the soaked clothes underneath, trying to be clinical about it, and not think about the fact that he was undressing an unconscious woman, orc or not. Her body was covered in bruises, deep purple and yellow marks that suggested she had been beaten before being thrown in the water, and there were rope burns around her wrists and ankles. Henrik felt anger kindle in his chest at the thought of anyone doing this to another living being, then pushed the emotion aside because anger would not help her breathe. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned and positioned her on her side so if she vomited she would not choke, then pressed his hands against her ribcage and started applying rhythmic pressure, trying to force the water out of her lungs the way his old commander had taught him. After a dozen compressions, she suddenly convulsed, and seawater came gushing out of her mouth, and she started coughing violently, her whole body shaking with the effort. Henrik quickly turned her more fully onto her side and supported her head while she emptied what felt like half the ocean onto his floor, making harsh, choking sounds that probably hurt worse than anything she had ever experienced. When she finally stopped coughing and collapsed back onto the blankets, her eyes cracked open for just a moment, and Henrik found himself staring into dark amber irises that seemed to glow in the firelight. She tried to say something, her cracked lips moving, but no sound came out except a weak rasp. Henrik held up his hands in what he hoped was a calming gesture and spoke softly, telling her she was safe, that she was going to be all right, that she needed to rest. Whether she understood him or not he could not tell because her eyes rolled back, and she lost consciousness again. But at least she was breathing more steadily now, her chest rising and falling in a regular rhythm. For the next 2 days, Henrik barely left her side except to tend to his chickens and milk his goat. He kept the fire burning hot, changed out the blankets when they got soaked with sweat, and tried to get water and thin broth down her throat whenever she was conscious enough to swallow. She drifted in and out of fever dreams, sometimes thrashing and crying out in the orcish language he did not understand, sometimes lying still as death. He noticed she had small tusks that curved up from her lower jaw, delicate things that looked like they had been filed down or maybe broken, and her pointed ears were pierced with several small bone rings. Her face, despite the bruises and the green tint to her skin, had an unusual beauty to it. All strong lines and fierce angles softened slightly by youth, because he guessed she could not be more than 20 summers old. On the 3rd day after he found her, she finally woke up properly, her eyes focusing on him with wariness and confusion as he knelt beside her with a cup of water. She tried to sit up too quickly and gasped in pain, clutching her ribs, and Henrik gently pushed her back down, explaining that she probably had some cracked ribs and needed to move slowly. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through fear, suspicion, and finally exhausted resignation. When he offered her the water again, she took it with shaking hands and drank deeply, then croaked out something in orcish before switching to heavily accented common. "Why?" she asked, her voice raw and painful sounding. "Why help?" Henrik sat back on his heels and considered the question, because honestly he had been asking himself the same thing for 3 days. Finally, he just shrugged and told her that he was a medic before he was a farmer, and old habits died hard, and he could not just let someone die on his beach regardless of what species they were. She studied his face as if searching for deception, then closed her eyes and turned her head away, and he saw a tear slide down her bruised cheek before she wiped it away with the back of her hand. "My name is Henrik," he offered after a moment of silence. "Henrik Lawson. This is my farm. You are safe here, at least for now. Karga," she whispered. "I am called Karga." She paused, swallowed hard, then added, "I have no clan now. They threw me to the ocean for speaking against war chief, for saying we should not raid your people's villages." Her voice was bitter and hollow. "So they called me traitor and human lover, and held me under water until I stopped fighting. Then they threw me overboard like garbage." Henrik felt that anger kindle again in his chest, hotter this time, because what she was describing was not combat or even execution. It was murder dressed up as justice, and he had seen too much of that in the wars. He told her she was not garbage, that what they did was wrong, and that she could stay here as long as she needed to heal. She opened her eyes again, and looked at him with such naked surprise that he realized she probably had not expected kindness from a human, had maybe never experienced it before in her life. Over the following weeks, Karga slowly recovered her strength under Henrik's care, though she remained wary and tense, always watching him as if expecting him to suddenly turn violent. He gave her his bed and slept on the floor by the fire, ignoring her protests that she could sleep outside or in his small barn. He brought her meals 3 times a day, simple fare of bread and cheese and vegetable stew, and tried not to notice how she always positioned herself with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door. She was living like a trapped animal expecting the cage to slam shut, and it made his heart ache in ways he did not want to examine too closely. As she healed, She started insisting on helping around the farm despite Henrik's objections that she needed more rest. She was stubborn as a mule about it, so finally he gave in and let her help feed the chickens and carry water from the well. He noticed she moved with a warrior's grace even when injured, her body clearly trained for combat, and she was surprisingly gentle with the animals despite her rough exterior. Timber, who usually barked at strangers for a week before warming up to them, took to her immediately, following her around the farm and leaning against her legs whenever she stood still long enough. One evening about a month after he found her, Henrik was repairing a hole in his roof and Karga was in the garden pulling weeds when a group of 3 men on horseback came riding up the coastal path toward his cottage. He recognized them immediately as trouble because they were wearing the crude militia uniforms of the village, and the leader was Marcus Holden, a bitter veteran who had lost his brother to an orc raid 5 years ago and made it his personal mission to hate everything with green skin. Henrik quickly climbed down from the roof and positioned himself between the riders and Karga, who had gone very still in the garden, her hand instinctively moving toward where a weapon would have been if she had one. Marcus pulled his horse to a stop and looked past Henrik at Karga with undisguised disgust. He announced that there had been reports of an orc spotted near the coast, and they were here to investigate, and well, what did they have here? Henrik kept his voice calm and steady as he explained that Karga washed up on his beach nearly dead, and he had nursed her back to health, and she was not a threat to anyone, and they could ride back to the village and tell everyone to mind their own business. Marcus laughed at that, a harsh sound without humor, and said that Henrik must have gone soft in the head living alone out here, because everyone knew orcs were savages and murderers, and having one on his property was just asking for trouble. Henrik felt his temper starting to slip but held it in check, because losing his cool would only make things worse. He pointed out that Karga had been here for weeks, and the only thing she had murdered was the weeds in his garden. And if Marcus had a problem with that, he could take it up with the magistrate in the next county over. The 2 other militiamen looked uncomfortable, clearly not eager to escalate the situation, but Marcus leaned forward in his saddle with a nasty grin and suggested that maybe Henrik was doing more than just nursing the orc girl back to health. Maybe he had gotten himself a little green-skinned bedwarmer, and was that not a disgusting thought? Before Henrik could respond, Karga stepped forward, her spine straight and her head held high despite the fact she was unarmed and wearing his borrowed clothes that were too big for her. She spoke in clear, cold common, telling Marcus that she understood his hatred because her own people had made war on his, but she was not his enemy, had never raised a weapon against humans, and had been cast out by her clan for refusing to do so. She said that Henrik Lawson had shown her more honor and kindness than anyone in her entire life, orc or human, and if Marcus wanted to threaten her, that was his right as a warrior, but he would leave Henrik out of it. There was a long, tense silence during which Henrik was certain Marcus was going to do something stupid like draw his sword. But finally, one of the other militiamen cleared his throat and suggested they should get back to the village before dark. Marcus stared at Karga for another moment, his face twisted with anger and something else Henrik could not quite identify, then spat on the ground and wheeled his horse around, calling back over his shoulder that Henrik was a fool and would probably get his throat slit in his sleep. The 3 riders galloped off down the path, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Henrik let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and turned to Karga, who was trembling slightly now that the confrontation was over. He started to say something reassuring, but she cut him off, her voice shaking with emotion as she told him she needed to leave, that her presence here was putting him in danger, that she should have gone weeks ago. Henrik surprised himself by reaching out and gripping her shoulder, firmly but gently, and telling her absolutely not. She was not going anywhere. This was his home, and he decided who stayed and who left. And she was staying until she was fully healed and had a plan and supplies for wherever she wanted to go next. She looked up at him with those amber eyes, and for the first time since she woke up in his cottage, her expression cracked, and he saw fear and grief and desperate gratitude all mixed together. She whispered that she did not understand why he was being kind to her, that it made no sense, that she was nothing and nobody and had nowhere to go even when she was healed. Henrik told her that kindness did not need to make sense, and as for having nowhere to go, well, his farm could always use an extra pair of hands if she wanted to stay longer term, and he would pay her fair wages, and she could have the barn loft fixed up as her own space. The words came out before he fully thought them through, but once they were spoken, he realized he meant them. And more than that, he wanted her to stay, wanted to keep seeing her in his garden and hear her terrible attempts at singing while she fed the chickens and watch Timber follow her around like a devoted shadow. Karga stared at him as if he had grown a second head, then abruptly turned and walked away toward the cliffs, and Henrik worried he had offended her somehow. But she just stood there at the edge of the bluff looking out at the ocean for a long time, her shoulders tight with tension. And when she finally came back, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady as she told him yes, she would stay, but only if he let her do a full share of the work and treated her like a hired hand, not a charity case. Henrik agreed immediately, and they shook on it, her grip strong and calloused against his palm. The weeks turned into months, spring warming into summer, and Karga became a permanent fixture of Henrik's life in ways he had not anticipated. She was a tireless worker, up before dawn and often still mending tools or preparing meals after sunset. She learned to tend the vegetable garden with surprising enthusiasm, and Henrik came home from fishing one day to find she had built an entirely new fence around the chicken coop, much sturdier than his old one, the posts sunk deep and lashed together with perfect precision. When he asked where she learned carpentry, she shrugged and said orc war camps needed fortifications, and building a chicken fence was basically the same thing but smaller. They fell into an easy routine, working side by side during the day and sharing meals in the evening while Timber sprawled between them by the fire. Henrik taught her to read and write common, which she attacked with the same fierce determination she applied to everything else, and within 2 months she was stumbling through the handful of books he owned. In return, she taught him basic orcish and some of the fighting techniques her clan had drilled into her since childhood. He was rusty from years away from combat, but his body remembered the movements, and they would spar in the evenings with wooden practice swords, circling each other in the yard while Timber watched and occasionally barked encouragement. It was during one of these sparring sessions in late summer that Henrik realized he was in trouble, and not the kind that involved swords or militias. Karga had just executed a perfect disarm that sent his practice blade flying into the bushes, and she stood there laughing, actually laughing, the sound bright and free and so different from the broken woman he had pulled from the ocean. The setting sun caught her face and made her green skin almost glow, and her amber eyes were sparkling with joy, and Henrik felt his heart do something complicated in his chest that had nothing to do with exertion. He had developed feelings for her, deep feelings, the kind that made a man do stupid things like lie awake at night thinking about someone or find excuses to stand close to them while working. He tried to push the feelings down and ignore them, because getting romantically involved with Karga was a terrible idea on multiple levels. She was orc, and he was human, which meant the rest of the world would treat them as abominations if they were together. She had been through trauma and was still healing, and the last thing she needed was him making things complicated with unwanted advances. And perhaps most importantly, she had never given any indication that she thought of him as anything other than her employer and maybe friend. And he would rather cut off his own hand than make her uncomfortable in the one safe place she had found. But feelings, as Henrik learned over the following weeks, did not care about logic or good sense. He found himself noticing little things about her constantly. The way she hummed old orcish songs while working, the rare smile that showed her small tusks, the careful way she handled baby chicks as if they were precious jewels, the fierce intelligence in her eyes when she asked him questions about the world beyond their little farm. He started looking forward to their evening meals together more than anything else in his day, and he had to consciously stop himself from finding excuses to touch her shoulder or hand when they talked. Karga, for her part, seemed oblivious to his internal struggle, though he sometimes caught her watching him with an odd expression he could not quite read. She had filled out since those early days, no longer gaunt and hollow-cheeked, and her bruises had faded to nothing. She looked healthy and strong, and she smiled more often, though there was still a sadness in her eyes sometimes when she thought no one was looking. Henrik wanted to ask what she was thinking during those moments, but he never quite found the courage. The summer was ending when everything changed. Henrik had gone to the village to sell some of his goat cheese and buy supplies, leaving Karga at the farm because she still avoided going anywhere near human settlements. When he returned in the late afternoon, he found her standing in the yard holding a bloodied axe, Timber barking frantically beside her, and 3 dead wolves scattered around the chicken coop. She had a long gash on her arm that was bleeding freely, and there were scratches on her face, but she was alive and so were all the chickens, somehow. Henrik dropped his bags and ran to her, his heart pounding with fear and relief, and immediately started examining her wounds while demanding to know what happened. Karga explained in a shaky voice that the wolves had come out of the forest in a pack, going straight for the chickens, and she had grabbed the axe and fought them off. But there had been 5 of them initially, and the last 2 ran off when she killed the 3rd one. She said it like it was no big deal, like fighting off a wolf pack with a wood axe was just another Tuesday, but Henrik could see she was trembling with adrenaline crash. He got her inside and cleaned her wounds, his hand steady despite his own racing pulse, and stitched up the gash on her arm with the same practiced efficiency he had used on soldiers years ago. She barely flinched during the process, just watching his face with an intensity that made him self-conscious. When he finally finished and bandaged her arm, he sat back and told her she was incredibly brave and incredibly stupid for fighting 5 wolves alone, and what would he have done if she had been killed? The words came out more emotional than he intended, his voice cracking slightly, and he realized too late that he had revealed more than he meant to. Karga went very still, her amber eyes locked on his face, and she asked quietly what he meant by that. Why would it matter so much to him if she lived or died? Henrik knew this was the moment he should deflect or make a joke, but he was tired of hiding, tired of pretending his heart did not race every time she smiled at him, so he took a deep breath and told her the truth. He said that it would matter because she had become the most important person in his life, because he looked forward to seeing her every morning and dreaded the thought of her leaving, because somewhere along the way he had fallen completely in love with her, and he knew that was probably wrong and complicated and unwanted, but there it was. The silence that followed felt like it lasted a year. Karga just stared at him, her expression unreadable, and Henrik started mentally preparing an apology and maybe packing his bags to leave his own farm because clearly he had just ruined everything. But then she reached out with her unbandaged arm and touched his face, her rough fingers gentle against his cheek. And she told him in a whisper that she thought she was going mad because she had been having the same feelings, had been lying awake in the barn loft at night thinking about him, wondering if he could ever see her as more than a rescued stray or a hired hand, terrified to hope because hope hurt worse than anything when it was taken away. Henrik covered her hand with his own and asked if he could kiss her, and she nodded, and then they were leaning in and their lips met, tentative at first and then more certain. She tasted like salt and honey, and something uniquely her, and her tusks pressed gently against his upper lip, and it was strange and perfect, and everything he had not let himself imagine. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard, and Karga had tears streaming down her face, and she told him she had never been kissed before, never been wanted like this, and she did not know how to be in love, but she wanted to try with him. They sat there on the floor of his cottage for a long time, holding each other while Timber watched with what Henrik could have sworn was approval. They talked about what this meant, how difficult it would be, the fact that many humans and orcs would despise them for being together. Karga said she had already been cast out by her people, so she had nothing to lose, but Henrik had a life here and neighbors, and she did not want him to sacrifice that for her. Henrik told her firmly that his neighbors could go hang if they had a problem with who he loved, and besides, he had chosen this isolated farm specifically because he was tired of people and their judgments, so if they could just live their lives out here together without bothering anyone, that would be more than enough for him. They decided to keep their relationship quiet for now, not advertising it but not hiding it either if anyone asked directly. Henrik moved Karga into the cottage properly, gave her half the bed instead of making her sleep in the barn loft, and they navigated the newness of being together with a combination of awkwardness and genuine affection. Karga was uncertain about physical intimacy at first, having no experience with it, so Henrik went slowly and let her set the pace, and they learned each other's bodies and boundaries with patience and care. The autumn came with cold winds and preparations for winter. Henrik taught Karga how to preserve vegetables and smoke fish, and she showed him orcish techniques for waterproofing leather and making fire-starting kits. They worked together to stockpile firewood and reinforce the cottage against storms, and in the evenings they would lie tangled together in bed, talking about their pasts and their hopes for the future. Karga told him stories about growing up in an orc clan, the harsh training and constant violence and the strange beauty of their traditions. Henrik talked about his time as a soldier, the friends he lost, the reasons he left that life behind to become a farmer on the edge of nowhere. They had been together for 3 months when Marcus and his militia came back, this time with more men, maybe a dozen total, all armed and looking grim. Henrik saw them coming up the path and quickly told Karga to stay inside while he dealt with them, but she refused, standing beside him as they faced down the mounted men. Marcus announced that the village council had met and decided that having an orc living so close to their settlement was an unacceptable risk, and they were here to escort her off the property and make sure she kept going until she was out of the region entirely. Henrik felt cold fury wash through him, and he told Marcus in a voice sharp as broken glass that Karga was not going anywhere. This was private property, and they had no legal authority to force anyone off it. Marcus sneered and said that might be technically true, but they had the numbers and the weapons, and Henrik was just one man, so maybe he should think carefully about whether this orc was worth dying over. Henrik did not hesitate before saying yes. She absolutely was, and if they wanted to remove her, they would have to go through him first. The militiamen shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting this level of resistance, and several of them looked like they were reconsidering this whole venture. But Marcus was not backing down, his face flushed with anger as he started saying something about traitors and orc lovers. Before he could finish, Karga stepped forward and spoke, her voice clear and carrying across the yard. She said that she would leave peacefully if it meant Henrik would be safe, that she would not let him come to harm because of her, and she thanked the militia for giving her time to gather her things. Henrik started to protest, started to say absolutely not, but Karga gave him a look that stopped the words in his throat. She turned and walked into the cottage, and he followed her, his mind racing for solutions. Inside, Karga was methodically packing a small bag with supplies, her movements jerky with suppressed emotion. Henrik grabbed her hands to stop her and told her they would figure something out. They could go to the magistrate, appeal to higher authorities, something. Karga shook her head and said that would take time they did not have, and she would not risk him getting hurt or killed in a fight against a dozen armed men. Henrik realized she was right, realized they needed to be smart about this rather than making a stand that would get them both killed, but the thought of her leaving tore at him like a physical wound. He asked her where she would go, and she said she did not know. Maybe north toward the Orklands, even though they would probably kill her for being a traitor, or maybe deeper into the wilderness to live alone. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Henrik pulled her into his arms and held her tight, and they stood there for a moment just breathing together. Then an idea struck him, wild and half-formed but better than nothing. He told Karga to trust him and follow his lead, and she nodded even though confusion was written all over her face. They went back outside where Marcus and his men were waiting, and Henrik announced in a loud, formal voice that Karga would indeed be leaving his property, because today she was going to marry him, which would make her a citizen by marriage with all the legal protections that entailed. And as his wife, she would obviously be living in his home, which was her right under regional law. The stunned silence that followed was almost comical. Marcus's jaw literally dropped open, and several of the other militiamen started whispering to each other in confusion. Karga stared at Henrik with wide eyes, clearly shocked, but he caught her gaze and tried to communicate with his expression that this was a legal strategy, a way to protect her, and she seemed to understand because she straightened up and announced that yes, she would marry Henrik Lawson if he was truly asking. Henrik said of course he was asking, had been thinking about it for weeks, but this seemed as good a time as any. And did anyone present have objections based on actual law rather than just prejudice? Marcus sputtered and said this was outrageous, that marriage between humans and orcs was not legal, but one of the other militiamen, an older man named Gerald, quietly pointed out that actually there was no law forbidding it. The regional code just said marriage was between two consenting adults and did not specify species. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue more but realized he had no legal ground to stand on. So instead he declared this was a mockery and Henrik was a disgrace, and they would be watching him closely for any sign of trouble. The militia rode off in a cloud of angry muttering, leaving Henrik and Karga standing alone in the yard. As soon as they were out of sight, Henrik turned to Karga and started apologizing, saying he should have asked her properly first, not just blurted it out as a legal maneuver. And if she did not actually want to marry him, they could figure out something else. Karga cut him off by kissing him hard, then pulled back with tears streaming down her face, and told him she had never imagined anyone would want to marry her, let alone be willing to publicly claim her as a wife knowing the consequences. And yes, she wanted to marry him, for real, not just as a legal strategy. Henrik felt relief and joy crash through him in equal measure, and he picked her up and spun her around, which made Timber start barking excitedly because he thought it was a game. When Henrik set her down, they were both laughing and crying at the same time, and he told her they needed to actually make this legal as soon as possible before Marcus found some loophole to exploit. The next day they rode together to the county seat 2 days' travel away, Karga wrapped in a heavy cloak to minimize attention, and found the magistrate's office. The magistrate was a tired-looking older woman named Harriet Dane, who raised her eyebrows when she saw them, but did not comment on Karga's green skin or tusks. She asked if they were both consenting adults entering this marriage of their own free will, and when they both said yes, she had them sign the register and speak the traditional vows. The whole ceremony took maybe 10 minutes, deeply unromantic and bureaucratic, but when the magistrate declared them legally married and Henrik kissed his wife for the first time, it felt more momentous than any grand celebration could have been. They rode back to the farm as husband and wife, and Henrik could not stop smiling the entire way. Karga seemed dazed but happy, occasionally touching the simple iron ring Henrik had bought her from a blacksmith in the county seat. She told him that in orc culture, marriage was sealed with combat, the two partners fighting to demonstrate they were worthy of each other, and Henrik laughed and said that sounded exhausting, and he preferred the human way of just signing papers and kissing. Karga smiled and said she preferred it too, though maybe they could spar later just for tradition's sake. Their first winter as a married couple was harsh, with heavy snows that isolated them completely for weeks at a time. Henrik had worried that being trapped in close quarters might strain their new relationship, but instead, he found himself happier than he had ever been. They spent the long dark evenings by the fire, Karga reading aloud from his books while he repaired tools or carved small wooden figures. She taught him orcish drinking songs that were surprisingly bawdy, and he taught her human dances that she performed with exaggerated clumsiness to make him laugh. They made love slowly and carefully, learning what brought each other pleasure, and Henrik thought he could live forever in the warmth of her arms and never miss the outside world. When spring finally came and melted the snow, they emerged from their winter cocoon to find that word of their marriage had spread through the region. Some of the neighbors started coming by, ostensibly to trade goods but really to get a look at Henrik's orc wife. Most were wary but polite, especially after Karga demonstrated her skill at carpentry by helping repair a wagon wheel for old farmer Jensen, who lived 5 miles down the coast. A few were openly hostile, including Marcus, who made a point of riding past their farm regularly, as if hoping to catch them doing something illegal. But there were also unexpected allies. Harriet Dane, the magistrate who had married them, sent a letter saying she had been asked by the village council to annul their marriage and she had refused, citing that it was perfectly legal and anyone trying to interfere would face legal consequences themselves. Gerald, the older militiaman, stopped by one day and apologized for being part of the group that tried to force Karga out, and he brought them a basket of early vegetables from his wife's garden as a peace offering. Slowly, grudgingly, some of the community began to accept their presence, or at least tolerate it. That summer, Karga discovered she was pregnant, and the news sent Henrik into a spiral of joy and terror in equal measure. He worried about the birth, about whether human and orc children would be healthy, about what kind of life their child would have in a world that saw them as an abomination. Karga seemed more calm about the whole thing, saying that life found a way and they would love their child fiercely and teach them to be strong in the face of hatred. Henrik built a cradle from driftwood and Karga sewed baby clothes from soft cloth, and they prepared as best they could for the complete upheaval a child would bring. The baby came in late autumn, a long, difficult birth that left Henrik pacing outside while the midwife he had brought from the county seat worked with Karga inside. When he finally heard the baby's cry, thin and reedy but strong, he burst through the door to find Karga exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny green-skinned infant with the smallest tusks he had ever seen. The midwife, who had been deeply skeptical about this whole situation, looked at the baby with wonder and pronounced her healthy and perfect. Henrik held his daughter for the first time and felt his heart grow 3 sizes. This impossibly tiny person who had his eyes and Karga's pointed ears and was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. They named her Anya, after Henrik's grandmother, and she became the center of their universe. Karga was a fierce and devoted mother, carrying Anya in a sling while she worked and singing her old orcish lullabies at night. Henrik found himself functioning on almost no sleep, but filled with more purpose than he had ever known, because now he was not just protecting Karga but their daughter, and he would burn down the world before letting anyone hurt either of them. Marcus showed up one last time when Anya was 3 months old, bringing his militia and declaring that they had reports of a half-breed abomination living on Henrik's farm, and they needed to investigate. Henrik met them at the property line with a loaded crossbow and a cold fury in his eyes, and he told Marcus in a voice like winter that his daughter was not an abomination. She was a citizen of this region by birth, and if Marcus set 1 foot on his property, he would put a bolt through his leg and claim self-defense. Marcus stared at him for a long moment, seemed to recognize that Henrik was absolutely serious, and finally turned his horse around and rode away. They never saw him again after that. The years passed in a blur of simple, hard-won happiness. Anya grew into a bright, curious toddler who loved timber and the chickens and would sit for hours watching her mother work. Henrik expanded the farm, building new structures and clearing more land for crops, and Karga became known along the coast as the best carpenter within 3 days' ride. They had 2 more children, a son named Torin with Henrik's brown hair and Karga's amber eyes, and another daughter named Miri who looked almost entirely human except for her pointed ears and unusual strength. The world did not become more accepting overnight, but their little corner of it did. The next generation of children in the nearby village grew up knowing Anya and her siblings, playing with them at market days, and slowly the old prejudices began to erode. Gerald's grandson married and had children around the same age as Anya, and the families became close friends. The new village council included younger members who were more interested in trade and prosperity than ancient feuds, and they approached Henrik and Karga about exporting their goods to other regions. On their 10th anniversary, Henrik and Karga climbed to the top of the cliffs overlooking the beach where he had found her all those years ago, leaving the children with Gerald's family for the evening. They sat on the rocks watching the sun set over the ocean, and Karga leaned her head on Henrik's shoulder and told him she had been thinking about that day a lot lately. She said that when her clan threw her overboard, she had truly believed her life was over, that she would die alone in the cold water and be forgotten. She never imagined she would wash up on a shore where someone would see her as a person worth saving, worth knowing, worth loving. Henrik wrapped his arm around her and said that finding her had been the best thing that ever happened to him, that she had taken his quiet, lonely existence and filled it with purpose and joy and more love than he knew what to do with. He told her he would go through it all again, every hard moment and frightening confrontation, just to end up here with her and their children and the life they had built together. Karga turned to kiss him as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, and Henrik tasted salt on her lips, though whether from spray or tears he could not tell. They walked back to the farm hand in hand as the stars came out, the lights of their cottage visible in the distance, warm and welcoming. Timber bounded ahead of them, and they could hear their children's laughter floating on the evening breeze as Gerald's grandson entertained them with some story. Henrik thought about how much had changed since that morning. He dragged a half-drowned orc woman from the ocean. How many obstacles they had overcome. How many people had told them their love was impossible or wrong. But here they were, a decade later, with a home full of love and children who would never know the loneliness their parents had felt. Here they were, proof that kindness could triumph over hatred, that love could bridge any divide, that hope was worth holding on to even when the waves tried to drag you under. Henrik squeezed Karga's hand and she squeezed back, and they walked together into their home, into the life they had fought so hard to build, into the future they would share until their last breaths. The ocean continued to crash against the rocks below, endless and patient, as it had for millennia and would for millennia more. But on the cliffs above, in a small cottage that smelled of wood smoke and baking bread, a human man and an orc woman tucked their children into bed and kissed them good night. They sat by the fire with cups of tea, planning tomorrow's work, arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to fix the barn door, and existing in the comfortable silence of two people who had found their home in each other. Sometimes Karga still had nightmares about drowning, about sinking into the dark water with her lungs burning, but Henrik would wake with her and hold her until the fear passed. Sometimes Henrik still worried about threats to their family, about Marcus or someone like him coming back with violence in their hearts, but Karga would remind him that they were stronger together than anyone who came against them. They had survived the worst the world could throw at them and come out the other side intact, and that was worth more than all the acceptance or approval of strangers. Their children grew up strong and proud, never ashamed of their mixed heritage, because their parents had taught them that love was more powerful than hate, that kindness was more valuable than prejudice, that family was defined by who you chose to stand beside, not what species you were born into. Anya became a skilled healer, learning from her father's old medical knowledge and her mother's practical approach to problem-solving. Torin took to farming like he was born to it, coaxing abundant harvests from the rocky coastal soil. Miri showed early signs of her mother's carpentry talent and her father's head for business, already drawing up plans for expanding their operations. On quiet evenings when the children were occupied with their own projects, Henrik and Karga would sometimes walk down to the beach, to the spot where he had found her between the rocks all those years ago. They would stand there holding hands, looking out at the vast ocean that had tried to kill her, but instead delivered her to salvation. Neither of them were particularly religious, but in those moments it felt like something larger than chance had been at work, like the tide that washed her onto his shore had been guided by forces that knew they were meant to find each other. Karga told him once, standing on that beach with the wind in her hair, that she used to be angry at her old clan for casting her out. She had carried that rage like a hot coal in her chest for years, letting it fuel her through the darkest moments. But somewhere along the way, she realized that their cruelty had inadvertently given her the greatest gift of her life, because if they had not thrown her overboard, she never would have met Henrik, never would have known the feeling of being truly loved and accepted, never would have built this beautiful, impossible family. The anger had transformed into something like gratitude, strange as that sounded. Henrik understood what she meant, because he felt similarly about the twists of fate that had led him to this isolated farm. If he had not left the military, if he had not chosen to settle on this particular stretch of coast, if he had not happened to walk that section of beach on that specific morning, their paths never would have crossed. All the pain and violence and loss he had experienced in the wars had pushed him toward a life of solitude that ended up being the exact opposite, a life full of connection and love and purpose. The terrible things that happened to both of them had somehow, against all odds, led them to each other. As their children entered adolescence and young adulthood, Henrik and Karga began to see the fruits of their labor in ways that went beyond their own family. Other mixed couples started appearing in the region, emboldened by their example, and while they still faced discrimination, the path was slightly less steep because someone had walked it first. The village that had once sent militia to drive Karga away now included her in community decisions, recognizing that her skills and knowledge were valuable regardless of her green skin. Human and orc merchants began establishing trade routes through the area, drawn by reports of a place where the two peoples could coexist peacefully. Henrik watched his wife become a pillar of their small community, teaching carpentry to anyone who wanted to learn, helping neighbors with construction projects, organizing cooperative efforts to build better roads and bridges. The frightened, broken woman he had pulled from the ocean had transformed into a confident, respected leader, though she always insisted she was just a farmer's wife doing her part. Her small tusks, which she used to hide by keeping her mouth closed, were now visible whenever she smiled, which was often. They celebrated 20 years of marriage on the same cliff where they had spent their 10th anniversary, though this time they brought their children along. Anya was courting a young human man from the next village over, a scholar who treated her like precious gold and did not care about her orcish heritage. Torin had his eye on the daughter of an orc trading family who passed through every summer, a fierce girl with braided hair and a laugh like thunder. Miri was still young enough to find romance disgusting, but old enough to appreciate the significance of her parents' relationship, having learned enough of the world to understand how rare and precious it was. They built a bonfire on the cliff top and roasted fish and vegetables while watching the sun set, and Henrik told the story of how he had found their mother, though they had all heard it 100 times before. Karga added details he always left out, like how terrified she had been when she first woke up in his cottage, how certain she was that he would hurt her, because that was all she knew of humans. She talked about the first time he made her laugh, something stupid he said while trying to teach her to milk the goat, and how the sound of her own laughter had startled her because she had not laughed in years. Anya asked if they had known right away that they were in love, and Henrik and Karga exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that came from 2 decades of partnership. Karga answered that she had known something was different about Henrik from the first moment, the way he touched her injuries with gentle hands instead of violence, but she had been too traumatized to recognize it as the beginning of love. Henrik said that he knew for certain during that sparring session at sunset, when she laughed and her whole face lit up, and he felt like he had been punched in the chest by emotion. Torin, ever practical, asked how they had dealt with all the people who hated them, and Henrik told him honestly that some days it had been incredibly hard, that there were moments when he questioned everything, when he wondered if loving Karga was selfish because it put her in danger. But then he would look at her and remember why he was fighting, and the difficulty seemed worth it. Karga added that you had to decide what kind of person you wanted to be, someone who let fear and hatred dictate your choices, or someone who chose love even when it was hard, and they had chosen love every single day for 20 years. Miri asked the question that had clearly been building in her all evening, her young voice uncertain but brave. She wanted to know if they ever regretted having children, knowing that their kids would face discrimination and hardship because of their mixed blood. The question hung in the air for a moment, heavy with vulnerability, and Henrik felt his heart clench because he recognized this was not an abstract curiosity, but a personal pain his youngest daughter was carrying. Karga moved to sit beside Miri, pulling her close and speaking with fierce intensity. She said that she had never, not for one single second, regretted bringing any of her children into this world, and anyone who made them feel lesser because of their heritage was a fool who did not deserve their time or energy. She told Miri that being different was not a weakness but a strength, that she carried the best of two peoples in her blood, and she should walk through the world with her head high because she was extraordinary. Henrik added that yes, their children would face challenges, but they would also have the tools to overcome them, the love and support and resilience that came from being raised by parents who refused to let the world's ugliness dim their light. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but Henrik noticed Miri stayed close to her mother for the rest of the evening, and he saw Karga press a kiss to the top of her daughter's head when she thought no one was looking. These moments of parental tenderness had become the defining feature of their lives, the small daily acts of love that built up into a foundation stronger than stone. As the fire burned down to coals and the children drifted off to sleep wrapped in blankets, Henrik and Karga sat together watching the stars wheel overhead. She leaned into his side, her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they existed in perfect quiet communion. 20 years of marriage had not dulled the spark between them, but had transformed it into something deeper. A banked fire that provided constant warmth rather than flashy flame. Karga whispered that she sometimes still had trouble believing this was real, that she would wake up and find herself back in the ocean drowning, that all of this had been a beautiful dream conjured by her dying mind. Henrik tightened his arm around her and told her it was real. She was real, their family was real, and he would remind her of that every day for the rest of their lives if necessary. She made a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and she turned to kiss him, slow and sweet, tasting of smoke and salt and home. The years continued their steady march forward, bringing both joy and sorrow as all years do. Gerald passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, and the entire community turned out for his funeral, including Karga, who spoke movingly about how his kindness had helped change the trajectory of her life. Harriet Dane retired from her position as magistrate and came to live in a small cottage near Henrik and Karga's farm, saying she wanted to spend her remaining years somewhere peaceful and close to people who understood that justice was more important than tradition. Anya married her scholar and gave Henrik and Karga their first grandchild, a perfect baby boy who looked entirely human but had amber eyes that glowed in certain lights. Torin brought his orc bride home and they built a house on the far edge of Henrik's property, expanding the family compound. Miri left to study advanced engineering in a city 3 weeks' travel away, and though Henrik worried about her facing prejudice in a larger, less accepting place, she sent letters assuring them she was thriving and had found a community of other mixed heritage people who supported each other. Henrik's hair went gray and then white, and his joints started aching on cold mornings, but he still worked the farm alongside Karga, who seemed to age more slowly, her green skin staying smooth while his wrinkled. They joked about it sometimes, how she would probably outlive him by decades, and they made plans for what she would do after he was gone. Karga always shut down those conversations quickly, not wanting to think about a world without Henrik in it, but they both knew the discussion was necessary. On their 30th anniversary, they were sitting on the porch of their cottage watching their grandchildren play in the yard when a group of travelers appeared on the road. As they got closer, Henrik realized with a jolt that they were orcs, a full war party by the looks of it, heavily armed and moving with purpose. His hand instinctively went to Karga's shoulder, and he felt her tense under his touch, her body remembering old trauma. The orcs stopped at the edge of the property, and the leader dismounted, a massive male with elaborate bone jewelry and ritualistic scars on his face. He called out in Orcish, asking if this was the home of Karga, who was once of the Red Rock clan, and Henrik felt Karga stand slowly, positioning herself in front of him protectively even though he was supposed to be protecting her. She answered in Orcish, her voice steady, saying yes, she was Karga, and what business did they have with her, the war chief, because that was clearly what he was, studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he did something Henrik did not expect. He knelt in the dirt and bowed his head, a gesture of deep respect. He said in Orcish that he had traveled many months to find her, to bring news that the old war chief who had cast her out was dead, killed in a stupid raid that accomplished nothing, and the clan had fractured in the aftermath. He said that many of the younger orcs had heard stories about Karga, about how she had spoken against needless violence, how she had built a life with humans instead of fighting them, and they wanted to know if the stories were true. Karga answered that yes, the stories were true, gesturing to Henrik and their family watching warily from the porch. She said she had been thrown into the ocean for refusing to raid innocent humans, and she had been saved by a human man who saw her as a person worth helping. And she had spent 30 years building a life based on cooperation and mutual respect, instead of hatred and war. The war chief rose to his feet and said that was what he had hoped to hear, because he was trying to lead his people toward a new path, a path of trade and peaceful coexistence with human settlements. But he faced resistance from the old guard who clung to the old ways. He asked if Karga would consider returning to the Orklands, not as a cast-out but as an advisor, someone who had successfully bridged the gap between the two peoples. Karga looked at Henrik, a question in her amber eyes, and he knew exactly what she was thinking. This was a chance to help shape the future of orc-human relations, to potentially save countless lives, but it would mean leaving their home and the life they had built. Henrik thought about it for maybe 10 seconds before telling the war chief that Karga would not be going anywhere without her husband, and if they wanted her wisdom and experience, they would get it as a package deal. The war chief looked surprised but not displeased, saying he had heard Karga's human husband was brave and honorable, and if Henrik was willing to travel to the Orklands and live among them, he would be afforded the same protections and respect as any clan member. Karga added that she would also not be leaving her children and grandchildren, and the war chief agreed to provide safe passage for the entire family. They took a week to prepare, selling the farm to Torin and his orc wife who were more than capable of running it, packing only what they could carry, and saying goodbye to neighbors who had become friends over the decades. Harriet insisted on coming with them, saying at her age she might as well do something interesting, and she had always wanted to see the Orklands. Anya and her husband decided to stay in the village with their children, but they promised to visit, and Miri sent word from her city that she would meet them in the Orklands once she finished her studies. The journey to the orc territories took 6 weeks of hard travel through mountains and forests Henrik had never seen before. The war chief's party treated them with cautious respect, clearly unsure what to make of this mixed family, but willing to follow their leader's example. Henrik and Karga rode side by side, their hands occasionally brushing together, drawing strength from each other's presence. At night, they would lie in their shared tent and talk about what lay ahead, the possibilities and dangers, and how strange it was that after 30 years of peace, they were embarking on a completely new adventure. The orc capital, such as it was, turned out to be a sprawling network of permanent camps and stone structures built into a mountain valley. Thousands of orcs lived there, going about their daily business, and Henrik saw children playing and merchants haggling and artisans crafting goods, all the normal activities of any civilization. The reaction to his presence was mixed, with some orcs staring openly at the human walking among them and others seeming not to care. Karga walked with her head high, her hand in Henrik's, and he took his cues from her, matching her confidence even when he felt completely out of his depth. The war chief, whose name was Grakther, gave them a house on the edge of the settlement and introduced them to the council of elders who governed alongside him. Karga began the delicate work of explaining how she and Henrik had built their life together, the compromises and understandings that had allowed them to thrive, and how similar principles could be applied to relations between their peoples. Henrik talked about human settlements and their needs and fears, trying to help the orcs understand that most humans were just farmers and merchants trying to survive, not warriors looking for a fight. It was slow, exhausting work, and there were setbacks and conflicts. Some orcs refused to abandon their hatred of humans, and there were incidents of violence that nearly derailed the whole peace process. But Grakther held firm, and Karga's voice carried weight because she had lived the bridge between the two worlds. Henrik found himself becoming a sort of unofficial ambassador, traveling to human settlements to explain that the orcs were genuine in their desire for peace, vouching for them based on his decades of living with Karga. 3 years into their time in the Orklands, formal peace treaties were signed between the major orc clans and the human regional governments. Trade routes were established, joint settlements were founded, and slowly, painfully, the two peoples began to learn to coexist. It was not perfect and probably never would be, but it was better than the endless cycle of raids and retaliation that had defined the previous generations. Henrik and Karga watched these developments with a mixture of pride and exhaustion, knowing their story had played a small but significant role in making it possible. Miri arrived from her city studies and immediately threw herself into designing infrastructure projects that would benefit both orc and human communities. Anya and her family visited regularly, and their children played with orc children without the fear and hatred that had poisoned previous generations. On a cool autumn evening, Henrik and Karga climbed to a high point overlooking the orc settlement, reminiscent of the cliffs above their old farm. They sat on the rocky outcrop watching the sun set over the mountains, and Henrik thought about the impossible journey that had brought them here, from a drowning orc woman on a beach to respected elders helping guide the peace between their peoples. Karga leaned her head on his shoulder, a gesture as familiar as breathing after 33 years together, and she said quietly that sometimes she wondered what her life would have been if her clan had never thrown her overboard. Henrik said he wondered the same thing about his life if he had not walked that particular stretch of beach that morning, but he was grateful every day that fate or chance or divine intervention had brought them together. She turned to look at him, her amber eyes still bright despite the years, and she told him that he had saved her life in every way that mattered, not just pulling her from the ocean but showing her that she was worthy of love and respect and dignity. Henrik touched her face, his fingers tracing the familiar contours, and he said she had saved him too, had taken his lonely, purposeless existence and filled it with more love and meaning than he had ever imagined possible. They sat there until the stars came out, holding hands and watching the lights of the settlement below, where orcs and humans and their mixed children lived and worked together in imperfect harmony. It was not the life either of them had expected, but it was theirs, built from salt water and kindness and stubborn refusal to let the world's hatred define them. Henrik thought about that first day, standing on his beach looking down at a dying orc woman and making the split-second decision to help her instead of walking away. He thought about every choice that had followed, every moment of fear or courage, every act of love in the face of hatred. He thought about their children and grandchildren, living proof that bridges could be built between any divide if people were willing to try. Karga squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, and they sat together under the stars. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds and changed their corner of the world through sheer determination and love. The ocean was far away now, but Henrik could still hear it sometimes in his dreams, the sound of waves crashing against rocks, the rhythm that had carried Karga to his shore and set them both on this improbable path. They were old now, their bodies showing the wear of decades, but their love had only deepened with time, transformed from desperate passion into something more profound, a partnership built on absolute trust and unwavering commitment. Henrik knew they probably did not have many years left together. That age would claim them sooner rather than later. But he felt no regret, only gratitude for every single day they had shared. As they finally stood to make their way back down the mountain to their home, Karga paused and looked back at the settlement one more time. She said that she used to think being thrown overboard was the worst thing that ever happened to her. But she had come to understand it was actually the beginning of everything good in her life, the moment that led her to Henrik and their family and this impossible peace they had helped build. Henrik pulled her close and kissed the top of her head, and they walked together down the darkening path, toward the home they had made in this strange new place, toward the family that waited for them, toward the future they had fought so hard to create. Behind them, the stars wheeled overhead, ancient and constant, bearing witness to one more love story in a world full of them, one more triumph of compassion over cruelty, one more proof that hope could survive even the deepest waters. And if sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, Karga still felt the phantom sensation of drowning, of salt water filling her lungs, Henrik was always there to anchor her, to remind her that she had survived, that she was safe, that she was loved beyond measure. They had both been lost in their own ways before they found each other, but together they had built something neither could have achieved alone, a life of purpose and meaning and joy, and a legacy that would outlive them both. The story of the orc girl who was thrown overboard and washed up on a human man's shore became legend in both communities, told and retold to children as an example of how love could bridge any divide. The details would change in the telling, becoming more dramatic and romantic, but the core truth remained: kindness in the face of cruelty, courage in the face of hatred, and love strong enough to change the world. Henrik and Karga lived to see their great-grandchildren born, a whole new generation who grew up in a world where humans and orcs worked together more often than they fought. They lived to see the peace they had helped build become the new normal, imperfect but holding. And when Henrik finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 79, with Karga holding his hand, he went knowing that his life had mattered, that the choice he made to help a drowning stranger had rippled out in ways he never could have predicted. Karga lived another 5 years without him, and while she grieved deeply, she also continued their work, continued building bridges and fostering understanding. She told their story to anyone who would listen, always emphasizing Henrik's kindness and courage, always reminding people that change started with individual choices to be better than the hatred that surrounded them. When she finally joined him in death, the funeral drew humans and orcs from hundreds of miles around, all coming to pay respects to the woman who had helped shape their world into something better. She was buried beside Henrik on a hill overlooking the settlement, and their graves became a place of pilgrimage for young couples of mixed heritage, who would come to leave flowers and draw strength from the story of two people who refused to let the world tell them who they could love. Their children and grandchildren carried on their legacy, continuing to build the peace and understanding that Karga and Henrik had started. The farm on the coast became a historical site, preserved as a reminder of where it all began, and visitors would walk down to the beach and look at the rocks where an orc woman had washed ashore and imagine the moment that changed everything. The world remained complicated and prejudice did not disappear overnight, but it was better than it had been, and it continued to improve with each generation. Mixed families became more common and more accepted. Trade flourished between human and orc settlements, and while there were still conflicts and setbacks, the foundation that had been laid held strong. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set over the ocean, people would see what looked like two figures standing on the cliffs, holding hands and watching the waves. Whether it was truly the spirits of Henrik and Karga or just tricks of light and shadow, no one could say for certain. But those who claimed to see them always reported feeling a sense of peace and hope, a reminder that love was stronger than fear, that kindness could triumph over cruelty, and that sometimes being thrown overboard was just the beginning of the most important journey of your life. The story that began with salt water and desperation ended with legacy and hope, with a world changed by the simple radical act of one person choosing to see another's humanity, regardless of the color of their skin. Henrik and Karga's love story became the foundation for thousands of others, proof that bridges could be built across any divide, that families could be forged from the most unlikely materials, and that sometimes the person who saves you is the one you were taught to fear. Their tale lived on in songs and stories, in the peaceful coexistence they helped create, in every mixed family that walked freely through both human and orc lands. It lived on in the choices their descendants made every day to choose understanding over hatred, cooperation over conflict, love over fear. And it lived on in the hearts of anyone who had ever felt like they were drowning and found an unexpected hand reaching down to pull them to safety. The ocean continued its eternal rhythm against the shore, washing away footprints and building new beaches grain by grain, patient and relentless. And somewhere in that vast blue expanse, in the space between waves, the memory of a drowning orc woman and the human man who refused to let her die remained, eternal as the tides, strong as stone, gentle as the moment when two people first realized that despite everything the world told them, they had found in each other a home worth fighting for.